Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Zvezda 1/100th or 15mm scale Soviet ISU 152 assault gun. This snap-together plastic kit is a cheap alternative to models available from Battlefront and can be used for Flames of War or Zvezda's own game Art of Tactic or any other game that uses 15mm scale models. The back of the box is simple and has a couple of images of the model at different angles and tells us that the kit comprises of 17 parts, is 9cm long, is easy to paint and easy to glue. Inside the box we find this sheet of paper with some information about Art of Tactic and on the other side, the instructions or assembling scheme. This is simple and easy enough to follow. I like the speech balloons that say snap, and if you read the Russian incorrectly like I do, it says wank, which is funny if you're a mature adult like me. The sprues come in a protective plastic baggie and are moulded in a nice almost Russian green. There aren't a lot of parts in this kit, though still more than some, like the Zvezda Panzer IV kit. The parts are fairly neat. There's barely anything in the way of mould lines, which is always nice to see. I couldn't see any casting errors or other imperfections. The details are reasonable, but as you might expect from one of these kits, they are quite simplified, most notably on the tracks. The wheels look great, but the tracks themselves are quite lacking in detail. This is the trade-off for having them all in one piece. Strangely enough, the whole bottom has a good amount of detail. You might notice that there are in fact two guns in this kit, the big 152mm gun and the longer 122mm gun, so you could build an ISU 122 if you wanted to. That's pretty cool, and I wasn't expecting that. The box didn't even really hint to it, unless I missed it, which is a possibility. The hull is probably the most detailed part, and I think it looks fairly good, though like I said it is a little bit simplified, but not to the point that it looks bad or lacking. After all, if you're buying this kit you probably aren't looking for a super detailed display piece. Let's put this thing together. The instructions seem to suggest building the gun first, and I figured, why not? Because the end of the barrel is flat, I start by drilling a hole in the end of it, making sure to drill as close to the centre as possible. Because my drill bit is so small, I widen the hole gently with my knife. This makes the gun look much better than it did before. I then glue the gun into the mounting like so. It's keyed so it only goes in one way. The end of the gun seems to have an odd angle, but it goes together nicely enough. You don't get any choice in how the gun is elevated or depressed, but that does mean it's very easy to put the gun on straight. I then glue on the mantlet, carefully sliding it over the gun to avoid getting glue on it. Probably should have put the glue on the other part. Oh well. I then press the mantlet into place. It does require a little bit of force. Looks pretty good to me. I set it aside to build the rest of the vehicle. I glue the hull side and suspension gear parts to the hull bottom. This is made easy by the guideposts. I'm sure you could find a way to put them on backwards, but it would be obvious to most people that they were doing it wrong, I would hope. Next, the spare track link part clips into place on the front of the lower hull here. This ended up looking a lot better than I was expecting. Then, this flat plate, which easily slots onto these guide pins like so. Unlike pretty much all of the other Zvezda kits that I've built, this one doesn't have a spine part, it has this instead. It's then time to glue the upper hull on. I test fit the parts but couldn't pull them apart again, and I ended up breaking the front guide pin off when separating the parts. The reason I wanted to take them apart was that the rear pin didn't lock into place, and I wanted to try and clean it up. After that, it didn't seem to want to fit properly anyway, and there was still a gap, so I just sliced off the rear pin as well. Removing the pins wasn't really an issue since I'm using glue, and the lower hull is shaped such that it will fit properly into the upper hull part. The parts fit together very nicely without the pins. The plate on the lower hull is shaped such that it locks right into the upper hull. I had to apply pressure to the rear of the hull to eliminate the gap there as best I could. It's still there, but it's not that bad. It is Soviet armour after all. Can't have Soviet armour without some gaps, right? Next, I attached the tracks. There are guideposts at the drive sprocket and idler wheel. The rest of the axle bits aren't guideposts, but they should rest against their respective wheels and suspension components, so I apply glue to those anyway. These slot into place quite easily, though a little pressure might be needed to ensure they go in all the way. They look okay, especially from the side. Track detail is definitely lacking, but that can be hidden by covering them in mud. I then try to add the rear armour plate to the casemate. This was kind of fiddly to get into place using the guide pin, so I just gave up on it and clipped it off. If you do this, it obviously won't stay in place if you're snap fitting everything, but it's fine if, like me, you're gluing. Just be careful to not break that handrail off. It's quite a fine bit of detail that looks easy to break. I then glue on the gun. This is pretty easy. It just clips right into place, though as with most of the parts a little pressure was needed to put it in place. I think this gun looks pretty good, better than I expected. To finish the model I add the external fuel tanks. This is pretty easy. They just slot into the holes on the sides of the hull rear here. Now let's compare the finished product with two Battlefront ISU 152s. The painted one is the resin and metal model and the grey one is the more recent plastic kit. You can immediately see that these are all very different models with varying dimensions and levels of detail. The resin and metal model is slightly wider and lower, and both of the Battlefront models are bigger than the Zvezda model. Their detailing is more chunky and there is more of it, which is unsurprising. Zvezda kits do tend to omit some detail in favour of simplicity and ease of assembly. The resin and metal model had a few different sculpts in the box with different stowage sculpted on, like that traditional Soviet log, which I really liked. Battlefront's plastic kit didn't have such, and on this one at least, I opted to leave the fuel tanks off. All three models came with the option of 152 or 122mm guns, which is nice. All of these models have different dimensions. The Zvezda kit is the most different, with the angles on the casemate being a bit more shallow. I'm not sure which is closer to being more realistic. I'm sure there are rivet counters out there that can point out that they're all wrong and bad, but you have to keep in mind that these are small, 15mm scale gaming pieces. These vehicles would probably look a little bit odd being in the same platoon together, but I wouldn't have an issue with all three of them being in the same army. So the Zvezda model might not be as detailed as the other two, but it's still pretty decent in my opinion, especially when you consider that it's a gaming piece and not a display model, and a cheaper one at that. The model was very quick and for the most part easy to build. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone familiar with Zvezda's 15mm scale kits. There were a few issues with the guide pins, especially in the upper hull and the rear wall of the casemate. It's not a big problem if you're gluing the parts together because you can just remove the pins, but if you want to do the snap together thing, it will be an issue. Like most Zvezda 15mm kits, this includes very little by the way of options, the only option really being which gun you use. And that was an unexpected surprise which I would be happy to see more of. Most of them don't even have that. The instructions were easy enough to follow, though a little bit confusing in layout having some of the sub-assemblies put below the completed model. But if you're paying attention, that's no big deal. It works very well for its intended purpose, and it should look pretty good with some paint on it. And if I needed more ISUs, I would happily buy more of these. I don't need more though, I already have 15. I do plan to get more Zvezda kits, in particular the Mouse and Jagdtiger, among others. I think they're pretty good models, especially considering their low price, and they're pretty fun to put together. They definitely won't please rivet counters, but who cares? I like them. What do you think of this model and Zvezda kits in general? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you want, feel free to subscribe to me here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. 12 out of 10 scientists recommend doing all three, and they wouldn't lead you astray, would they? If you really like the things I do, please consider helping to support the channel over at patreon.com/Herberterpaderp. That would be very, very good. Check the links in the description for further information. I shall return soon, so until then, happy modelling and thanks for watching. Farewell.